and welcome to our fourth annual Founding Fathers Distinguished Lecture. This year, of course, it is virtual. Here to introduce our speaker for the evening is the president of Wagner College, Dr. Joel Martin.
Thank you, Provost Krause. Welcome to all to the Founding Fathers Lecture for 2021. The Founding Fathers Lecture Series is sponsored by several generous donors, including Rich Herberger, Butch Savage, Alex Fox, Graham Fox, Joan Nicholas, Rudy Mueller, and Dr. Norman and Irene Schaefer, and others. We are so grateful to them for their support, which helps ensure that Wagner is able to attract leading thinkers, especially conservative thinkers, to enrich our discourse as a community seeking to serve our nation better always. I am particularly pleased to have the honor of introducing our speaker tonight, Dr. Colleen A. Sheehan. Her record is truly remarkable. She was not only an elected public servant, but is a renowned, well-published scholar and expert on James Madison. Colleen A. Sheehan is professor of political science and director of graduate studies in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. She had previously served at several other leading institutions, including Villanova University. While a citizen of Pennsylvania, she served in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and on the Pennsylvania State Board of Education. She has been an Earhart Fellow, Bradley Fellow, Mary and Kennedy Smith Fellow, and Garwood Fellow at the James Madison Program of Princeton University. She's published several books, two of them with Cambridge University Press, The Mind of James Madison, The Legacy of Classical Republicanism, and the other title, James Madison and the Spirit of Republican Self-Government. She's also published Friends of the Constitution, Writings of the Other Federalist, 1787 to 88, with Gary L. McDonald, and the Cambridge Companion to the Federalist, also with Cambridge University Press in 2020. She is published in the top journals, the American Political Science Review, William and Mary Quarterly, Review of Politics, and Persuasions, the Jane Austen Journal. Her current projects include The World of Emma Woodhouse, an interpretation of Jane Austen's Emma, and Madison's America. Please join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Sheehan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Martin and Provost Krause. It's an honor to be here with Wagner College, even though I wish I could be there with you. And I won't practice what Jane Austen had one of her characters say in one of her novels, that from politics, it is an easy step to silence. There's one place I disagree with Jane Austen. Well, I've been asked today to talk about James Madison and how some of his ideas might apply to America today. So I thought we would take a little look at this thing we call the cancel culture. And I gave some thought to what Madison might think about that. Now, according to Madison, there's a degree of depravity in the human soul that makes government necessary. Many of you are familiar with that quotation from Federalist 51, when he says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither internal nor external controls on government would be necessary. But of course, the problem is that men are not angels. But Madison also believed that human beings also have the potential for virtue, thus making good government possible. As a former, the degree of depravity of mankind requires checks and controls on the human passions and interests. The latter depends on the soundness of the citizens' characters, mores, and opinion. That is, good government depends on the character of the citizens, which further depends on whether the people have been properly educated in the spirit of small r, Republican government. In other words, popular government. Madison's unique contribution to American politics was the discovery of a way to preserve individual freedom and at the same time achieve popular government grounded in stability, justice, and the general good. To do this, he had to address the problem of faction, or more particularly, the latent causes of faction, namely opinions, passions, and interests, the things that move human beings. Now, these causes of faction, Madison said, are shown in the nature of human beings. Human beings possess the capacity to reason, but that reason is fallible. Therefore, we tend to form different opinions. Add to this that our selfish interests and passionate biases often affect the way we think, resulting in conflict, divisiveness, and sometimes rancor. And it's easy to see the problem Madison was so concerned about. The age-old problem of injustice and tyranny, Madison taught, stems from the selfishness and prejudices that too often take up space in our hearts and minds. But rather than attempt to remove these causes of faction from man's nature, which would require the destruction of liberty, or force people to have all the same opinions, passions, and interests, which is impossible, Madison argued that what we should do is control the effects of faction. How? By establishing popular government over a large territory, thereby encompassing a great number and diversity of interests and sentiments. Since there'll be more differentiation of views in this extensive territory, narrow interests and prejudicial opinions will be weeded out. At the same time and more effort will have to be spent to form a majority coalition. To achieve a majority consensus, communication, debate, and deliberation will be necessary. And not only by public officials within the institutions of government, but Madison said by citizens throughout the whole society. In the Virginia Report of 1800, Madison acknowledged that freedom of speech and the press are necessarily accompanied by some degree of abuse. Nonetheless, these are the vehicles by which we communicate our views in a free society. And just as they are indispensable to a free electoral system, they are the guardians of all other rights, and indeed the basis for what Madison called, quote, the triumphs which have been gained by reason and humanity over error and oppression, unquote. Of course, he's thinking primarily there about the American Revolution. For Madison, the cornerstone of the American constitutional system is the free communication of opinions among the great body of the citizens, the suppression of which should be viewed, he said, with universal alarm. For such acts in time will, quote, destroy our free system of government or prepare a convulsion that might prove equally fatal to it, unquote. The free exchange of ideas is not only how liberty is preserved, it's the way individuals learn to become citizens. Let me restate this because it's of central importance to free government and central importance to Madison's thought. Engaging with others in an open and public exchange of ideas, including views and ideas with which we disagree, is the way we learn to become fellow citizens with each other. We take seriously the experiment in Republican self-government by taking each other's ideas seriously. Now, this does not mean accepting other people's ideas as truth necessarily. On the one hand, public discourse involves taking a stance and often disputing the claims of others. But on the other hand, it includes the willingness to put your own views to the test of fair argument and debate. Madison's model of what he called the, quote, commerce of ideas is the way he sought to achieve the refinement and enlargement of the public views. The process is educational and is the way we form the habits of a healthy civic life. So there's a sense in which what those of you who are in school, or those of you who have been at school, in public schools or in college, the way that you learn there through disputation and weeding out the opinions that don't stand up to the force of other people's questioning into reason is a very similar way it works in civic life in terms of the process of what we might call deliberative republicanism, the debate that takes place at the level of society and that also takes place in the halls of Congress and between one House of Congress and the other House of Congress, between the legislative branch and the presidency, and then again between the senators and the congressmen and their constituents. All of this is a weeding out of a kind of a method of disputation in very much a similar way that we use the Socratic method in schools and colleges. Now, accordingly, Madison's archetype for free government is one that would emphatically have rejected what today we call cancel culture. That is the suppression of opinions you don't agree with or you just don't like. Even when you think someone else's opinions are false, bigoted, pernicious, or even politically dangerous, Madison taught, it is generally better to combat the error with calm and reasoned arguments rather than leveling accusations of sedition or calling for censorship. Remember, Madison was one of the ones who led the charge against the Sedition Acts with Jefferson. Facts, Madison said, are slippery things. For, quote, opinions and inferences and conjectural observations are in many cases inseparable from the facts, unquote. Moreover, Madison argued the free formation, expression, and exchange of ideas is the foundation for all of our other freedoms. The effort to force people into compliance by silencing them is precisely the mode utilized by despots in order to maintain power. Thwarting communication is a tool of tyrannical souls, whether done by public officials, leaders in private tech industries, or deans and provosts in academia. It should be noted that the Madisonian idea that a large territory can control the effects of the contagion of factious opinions and passions, including those fueled by dishonest motives, today actually faces a challenge that threatens to render it relatively ineffective in the work of controlling the effects of faction. Why? With improved technology came improved communication, including, as you know, the telegraph, telephone, radio, television, and now, of course, the internet, including the various modes of social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat. Our age is one of almost instantaneous and hyper communication. Opinions, including not just healthy and good opinions, but narrow, dogmatic, prejudicial ones, travel seemingly at the speed of light. And when a video or tweet or message of some sort goes viral, and it's communicated to many millions of people in such a short span of time, the Madisonian solution of employing territorial space to buy time for an opinion so that it might be debated, refined, enlarged, is simply no longer going to work. Instead, the contagion of prejudice becomes a disease that is left virtually unchecked, annulling the role that deliberation was intended to play in shaping what Madison called the reason of the public. So in other words, the small republic argument that Madison talked about when he looked at ancient Greece and the ancient Greek polis, remember Plato says there are 5,040 citizens in the polis. And so it's so small that everyone meets in person in the assembly, and a prejudice, a factious opinion can spread like wildfire. So that's why Madison uses the analogy of a disease that's a contagion. And so it's too easy then for majority faction to rule. So the large territory was supposed to help solve that problem. The problem of our day is that equivalent to the contraction of territorial limits are the increased modes of communication that make it easier. Madison actually talked about this. He anticipated this in an article called Public Opinion. So he knew that there was a trade-off each way. A territory, as it got larger, helped control the effects of faction more, but the increased modes of communication would be equivalent to shrinking the size of the territory, or the way we often put that today is the world has become a much smaller place. Now, what has caused the emergence of cancel culture in America? Why are so many people so desirous of silencing those with whom they disagree? Cancel culture is essentially an outgrowth of the new identity politics as it's come to be defined and practiced in contemporary America. The First Amendment to the Constitution sets forth the right of freedom of speech. And you probably know that Madison introduced the First Amendment along with the other amendments that became the Bill of Rights. So within the First Amendment is the right of freedom of speech. Now, the current preoccupation with protecting the feelings and esteem of selected minority groups is putting America's commitment to freedom of speech to the test. In fact, a recent survey shows that American college students are closely divided on whether to favor protection of the First Amendment at all, or instead to substantially restrict speech in order to promote a more inclusive society. When opinion is thought by a member of a protected minority group to be offensive or damaging to that person's sense of self-worth, proponents of identity politics often call for silencing the other person, if not demanding his or her public reprimand, resignation, or even employment termination. This is a particularly dangerous aspect of the power of public opinion, of a particular kind of public opinion, of non-deliberative, factious opinion in our society today. It's a new form of despotism, at once commanding, domineering, stifling, pervasive, utterly inescapable, and completely invasive. Cancel culture has amplified the potentially harmful effects of what Tocqueville called the omnipotence of public opinion, demanding not only silence and conformity, but often punishment as well. The non-conforming party must be made to feel pain. Vengeance and retribution are thus the weapons of choice. Rejected are the old weapons of choice, that is, free argument and debate. Let me quote Jefferson on that. Here's Jefferson. Truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and has nothing to fear from the conflict, unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, error ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them, unquote. Now, perhaps Jefferson's a bit too sanguine about the effects of free argument debate. Obviously, I don't think they always result in the truth of the matter being discovered. But I think it's pretty clear that without the exercise of free argument and debate, we've given up on the enterprise of even seeking after the truth. Now, I'd be the first to agree that there are some opinions and comments that, as Jane Austen once remarked, simply do not deserve the compliment of rational opposition. But a political society without the free communication of opinions, without debate and deliberation, and without the means to come to a consensus is no political community at all. In ancient Greece, there was a name for people who would not engage their fellow citizens in civic discourse and public life. They were called, quote, idiots, unquote, idiotes, and considered selfish and unmindful of the common things. In fact, this is the root of the word where the English word idiot comes from, and idiosyncratic and idiom. They were also considered a threat to the polity, damaging to the ties of civic life. Cancel culture promotes what the Greeks called civic idiocy. It undermines the bonds of citizenship and makes mutual forbearance and mutual respect impossible. The advances in communications technology that have made the spread and growth of rank prejudices and hasty denouncements all too easy require new and creative remedies for democratic governments in the 21st century. Still, the answer cannot be to silence what you do not like. Neither is the solution anti-populism in the sense of taking the people out of the equation as much as possible and substituting the views of intellectual elites and agency experts for ordinary citizens. Both remedies are contrary to the form and spirit of popular government. In a free nation, the only remedy for falsehood is truth. For the lack of civic understanding, civic education, and for mean-spiritedness, goodwill. Indeed, perhaps the thing most needful in America today is civic goodwill, with probably civic education coming in a close second. How might we get beyond the current attitude of disrespect and disdain and work to build a healthier, more constructive, more amicable way of doing the political work of our nation? It seems to me that two chief concerns need to be underscored. The first has to do with disagreement and diversity. The second with agreement and harmony. What things can we disagree about and accept the kind of differentiation and diversity that an advanced modern society necessarily encompasses, including differences in economics, geography, religion, race, ethnicity, and generational differences? Although these kinds of distinctions are sometimes sources of conflict rather than just merely varietal contrast, the disagreement need not be permanent or politically lethal. As long as the tenets of religious, economic, and civil liberty, including freedom of inquiry, freedom of conscience, and freedom of speech, are intact, the large republic of the United States can still accommodate a great multiplicity of backgrounds and beliefs. This is the e pluribus half of our nation's informal motto. The unum or unity half of the motto is a much more challenging task for Americans today. The United States is a large, diverse federal polity, but it is not a pluralistic society in the sense of not having or needing a common principle. We're diverse, but the diversity cannot be unlimited. Toleration cannot take the place of a unifying regime principle, because to tolerate everything leaves a polity with nothing. Freedom cannot be tolerant of tyranny, for example, without destroying itself in the process. In essence, there are conditions of freedom. As Aristotle, Madison, and Lincoln taught, every political order has a principle, a central idea that binds it together, that informs its spirit and its way of life. The multiplicity of economic interests, of religions, and of racial and ethnic backgrounds are perfectly compatible with the existence of a common small r Republican purpose. But some ideological viewpoints, however, are not. What things fall outside the rubric of matters upon which we can agree to disagree? What principles must we hold in common if we are to preserve the American Union? And I use the term American Union here more in reference to the unity of the people in this sense than in terms of the union of the states. The fundamental principles that inform the American Republic are twofold. One is the way we do things, the way we live. The other is the purpose of our way of life. The United States was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The principle of liberty to all, is the operating manual of American civic life. It's grounded in the idea of the freedom of the human mind, and thus the right of each individual to freely form his or her opinions and to openly communicate those views. Just as liberty is the way the Americans live, The idea of human equality informs the purpose of our way of life. It is, as Lincoln said, the standard maxim for which we strive. At the core of this equality is the idea of self-rule, that every human being has a capacity to govern himself. This is why it's not enough simply to assert our rights. Our rights are only meaningful if they're accompanied by our obligations to one another. We owe to each other the same respect for their freedom that we demand for our own. This is the mutual pledge of faith that James Madison taught forms the basis of America's social compact. This is the promise the founding generation made explicitly, one to another, when they ratified the Constitution of the United States and formed a more perfect union. And it is the promise that each of us in succeeding generations has tacitly made in accepting the mantle of American citizenship. So it is not only in the assertion of our rights that we show ourselves to be citizens of the United States, but in the recognition and active fulfillment of the debt of protection, and those are Madison's words, debt of protection that we owe to our fellow citizens. Rather than canceling and defriending one another, it seems to me that it's time again for Americans to remember the mystic cords of memory that stretch across the vast land and which have bound us together as one people for over 2 centuries. It's time for us to listen and to hear again the clarion call tasking us to tend the sacred fire of liberty, understanding that the destiny of the Republican model of government is still and finally staked on the experiment of self-government entrusted to the hands of the American people. Back in the last century, when the clash of ideas that's at stake today began to take root among the nation's intelligentsia, the poet Robert Frost gave a series of talks, wondering what would become of America and of the mission of the American people. And thinking this through, Frost remarked that the American dream is one of a new land where the people are in control, in self-control. In other words, self-government. Among the founders, Frost said, the best dreamer of that dream was James Madison. It's not about liberties conferred, but more about liberties to be taken, Frost said. It's not just about ourselves, but about our fellow citizens and the pledge we have made one to another. That pledge, that promise, Frost taught, means that we cannot live as solitary, merely private beings, unattached to our neighbors. Like the ancient Greek idiot, a person with no country. And so Frost wrote a poem about this idea, a poem I suspect that you've heard before. In closing, let me recite that poem and ask you to think about what it means, especially the part in it about promises. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bell a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. The promises in this poem, Frost once told an audience, are of 2 kinds. The promises I make for myself, and the promises, and these are Frost's words, quote, my ancestors made for me, known as the social contract, unquote. In this poem about a solitary individual who pauses for a time at the edge of snowy woods on the winter solstice, Frost reminds us of the American promise. Like that, we have pledged to live together in community, according to a way of life we deem worthy of our ideas and our aspirations. So too had Robert Frost taken that pledge, made that promise. And like him, we too have promises to keep and miles to go before our country sleeps. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sheehan. If there are any questions, please enter them, into the chat, and I will read them, and our speaker will answer them. So, hopefully we'll have some questions in a moment. Here's an interesting question. Madison was president the last time the US Capitol was invaded. In practice, the United States was very fractious. Would he have been okay if New England had succeeded?
Well, I mean, of course, these are hypotheticals. We can only guess, but I think I can safely say no. In his last, what are considered his last words, he talked about this attempt of disunion. He was then talking about this. He's the last of the founders. He lives until 1836. So of the people who were at the Constitutional Convention, Madison is here the longest. And he's very worried about what John C. Calhoun in South Carolina is up to, and these threats of secession and so on. And so his last advice to his country is to beware this idea of disunion. It's like the serpent crawling into paradise, he says. And of course, there was an attempt in the 1790s by no other than Aaron Burr to, there was talk about separation of the New England portion of the United States, in which Burr would then become president of that. It never came to fruition, but it was talked about. But Madison thought that the Union was, I think, very much in the vein of Lincoln, that it was a Union meant to be perpetual.
All right, our next question. How can you be civil when people want to cancel you?
That's a great question. It's very difficult, isn't it, to remain civil amidst a great amount of rancor and hostility. But it's always harder, isn't it, in some ways, to take the high road than the low road. But then think about that. If it becomes part of the way you decide business, friends, with your fellow citizens, in some ways, it's easier to take the high road than to take the low road, and not be at the mercy of others. Don't let them dictate to you your actions. Stand up, have the courage of your convictions, and be the kind of human being you want to be. Don't be slavish and only react to somebody else. So it's one of those kinds of things that it's not necessarily easy. We're all passionate. And when people are trying to cancel us, and oftentimes this goes with quite a lot of hostile speech, if not actions, I'm not going to pretend that it's easy. But it's the right thing to do. And every time you do it, it's a little bit better than it.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Madison was one of the founders of our government. Would he be pleased in how it has evolved since the late 1700s?
I'd like to play Socrates here and ask whoever asked that question what he or she thinks. Do you think Madison and the founders would be happy with the way things have evolved in America? I'm guessing that you asked this question because you think that at least part of the answer is no. They would. Their handiwork and the country moving from sea to shining sea. Remember, Madison is Secretary of State under Jefferson, and they're the ones sending out Lewis and Clark to the West Coast, right? So this idea of spreading across the country and envisioning this large, truly large republic, much larger than 13 states. I think that this would be, it would be amazing to see that it's actually happened. But I think it'd be something that they would be very happy and proud of. The things that they wouldn't be so happy about, I think the founding generation in general, Washington, Hamilton, John Adams, Gouverneur Morris, Ben Franklin, is that right now we're not sure we want to be one people any longer. We're at war with ourselves, very similarly in the way that we were in the 1850s. And we're at a crossroads. We don't know where we'll go. When Washington was president, he wanted to step down in 1792 and go back to Mount Vernon. And both sides of the political parties that were forming, Federalists and Republicans, pleaded with him to stay. Jefferson wrote him this letter and said, "You have to stay. You have to stay. The country, America is not ready to walk alone." And Washington stayed another term. And by 1796, he thought we were in a kind of a condition that we were able to understand ourselves and our national character, is the way he put it. Having a national character, knowing what you're about, knowing what your country stands for, is the first order of business. And right now in America today, Americans are unsure of that. And that is a very precarious situation for any regime. This is the kind of thing that revolutions and civil wars are made of.
Okay. Our next question. What are your thoughts on how pre-K through 12 schools can promote civic engagement, dialogue, and education from your perspective?
Oh, what a great question. In fact, I am now at a school here in Arizona. I came here for this reason, to the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, headed up by Paul Carisse. And it's dedicated to precisely this kind of thing. And one of our initiatives that Paul Carisse and Adam Seagrave are heading up is is an initiative on civic education for K through 12. And it involves both an understanding of the content, in other words, an understanding of the country's history and constitutional principles and processes, and the tools of what it means to be a citizen, as well as engagement in healthy practices of civic life, participation, the way Tocqueville talked about that. And so we, as at Arizona State, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, are working with Danielle Allen of Harvard and also with Tufts to promote this across the country. Arizona has a new requirement in terms of civic education in our state, and we're hoping that other states will follow suit and make this a priority in K through 12 education.
Our next question. How can we deliberatively and collectively determine those boundaries you discussed about what kind of speech is not acceptable and can be stopped. Seems very difficult without sliding down a slippery slope.
Sure, it is, but the courts have done, have decades and decades and actually centuries thinking about this and have come to pretty good conclusions about this. And it has to do with things such as speech that's, crying fire in a crowded theater, things that bring about imminent danger. And so other than that, for political speech, if it doesn't pose that kind of imminent danger, I think we don't have to like it, and we should speak out against it. Though there are times when giving it a platform and listen and is probably the worst thing to do, but we don't need to shut it down. I mean, most of the people who are wanting to engage in that kind of speech want attention. So part of when it's just irrational arguments and prejudices, we can, if we think that there's a possibility of healthy dialogue, engage and try to persuade. Persuasion, it seems to me, is always better than force or power, because once you're talking force or power, then you've given up on any kind of public discourse. But the courts have shown us what the limits are of speech. We have a pretty good understanding of that through constitutional law dealing with the First Amendment. And I think that's been a very good way to think about this. And recently, it's too bad that the First Amendment is being abused the way it is.
Our next question: was society more fractured or less at the time of the revolution compared to today?
I wouldn't know how to measure that in any kind of, quantitative analysis, except to say that on this side of the Atlantic, we were more united then than we are today. But of course, if you're going to talk about Americans as colonists in their role with their fellow citizens of Great Britain before Lexington and Concord, then I would say certainly both societies are deeply fractured. But Americans on this side were fairly united. I mean, Jefferson, when Henry Lee asked him in 1825, tell me what this Declaration of Independence, where'd you get these ideas? What does it mean? And Jefferson wrote back and he said, those weren't just my ideas. That was an expression of the American mind. So Americans at the time were fairly united in their opposition to no taxation without representation.
Our next question: did you say that some opinions should be canceled? Who decides? Shouldn't all opinions be heard and challenged as appropriate, rather than silence opinions we don't agree with?
Well, I would never say never, because politics and ethics are practical sciences, and prudence is always necessary in certain situations. I would say in general, as a rule of thumb, that's true, that opinion should not be canceled. However, I do think there are some forms of speech which create imminent danger. And so in those cases, we do have to have laws that are applied appropriately. But they're very few cases, they're very rare.
Our next question is: the cancel culture that refutes what Madison has said, how do you convince them to recognize these values?
I'm sorry, how do we convince them to recognize
these values?
Well, there's the rub, isn't it? How do you persuade someone of something if they won't listen? This is, if those of you who've studied some politics might remember that in the very first page of Plato's Republic, this is exactly what it's about. How do you persuade someone who won't listen? Your only choice when someone won't listen, if there's no possibility of persuasion, is power. It's like bullets versus bullets, persuasion versus power. So I don't know how to persuade folks who've decided that they're shutting their ears, the kind of folks that, cancel out their friends on Facebook and they just won't listen anymore. I think the best we can do is start with our friends and our neighbors. And for those of us who are teachers, students, and first settle ourselves that we're always willing to listen, that we don't know it all, have a little bit of humility about our own opinions. There's always some, and that's certainly the case for college professors as much or more than for the ordinary citizen. We have a lot to learn. And so first we have to practice what we teach. And second, just work on, I think, the K through 12 civic and teaching healthy habits of life is one of the things that is important now, rather than bringing children up with this expectation that anything that they hear that's offensive should be I think that's a very unhealthy attitude in a free society.
Our next question. What would Madison think of populism?
Of populism?
Yes.
Populism. I'm not exactly sure what populism is. That's a term we throw around quite a lot, isn't it? I mean, was Trump a populist or not? Was Teddy Roosevelt a progressive or a populist? If what we mean by populism is popular government, that the people ultimately rule, Madison was for that. He's very, very clear on this. He is not at all, he does believe in refining and enlarging the public views and representative democracy, and developing the reason of what he calls the reason of the public. So he doesn't want the fleeting passions to rule, but he says that the majority will ultimately give the law. And so that's why it's so important to Madison that we form good habits as citizens and as human beings, and form good opinions, or what Tocqueville would call habits of the heart and habits of the mind. However, if what we mean by populism is something very different, that it's just sort of majority rule without any kind of refinement of the public views, then clearly Madison would be opposed to that. Fisher Ames during the ratification debates talked about that, and some of the founders would say, "The people, sir, your people, they're a great mob. We need a second thought, a second sober thought." And so there was a lot of opposition among the founders to this idea of populism, if what you mean by that is just popular fleeting views carrying the day. But of course, that's what faction generally is. It's the first thoughtful mode of expression that oftentimes is fueled by not just passion, but the worst passions are prejudices.
Our next question. How much should civic literacy weigh on the responsibility of a person's words and opinion? Do you think that America today suffers from a dangerous level of civic idiocy?
Yes. We certainly suffer from a lack of knowledge and understanding. It's not just knowing the facts, that's one thing, but it's understanding the way free government works. Madison said that liberty and learning lean on each other, and one without the other is a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. There's no other government that requires the degree of genuine understanding about the responsibilities of citizenship than truly free government, popular government. So we're not in the greatest case right now in terms of our civic literacy. There was a study done a few years ago by a Bill of Rights Center, not the Bill of Rights Institute, a different one in Chicago. And they asked people about the First Amendment. What are they asked them a lot of questions, but one of them was, can you name some of the rights in the First Amendment? Because, you know, there are 5 that are part of this. And a lot of people got freedom of speech, but hardly anybody got all of them. And most people couldn't get beyond 1 or 2. And some of the most popular ones that people thought were in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution were the right to drive a car, the right to own pets. But my favorite is the right to plead the 5th. So I think we have some work to do in terms of civic literacy in the country.
Okay. Our next question. Did the founders place any limitations on freedom of speech? On what principle?
Did they place any limitations on freedom of speech? And if so, on what principle?
Yes.
Yes. Well, you know, this was a huge debate at the time of the founding, because the English the English right of freedom of speech is a very different animal than the American understanding of freedom of speech. In the English version, truth and falsehood plays a part. In the American version, not at all. You don't have to be telling the truth to have freedom of speech. We are allowed to get it wrong. Now, hopefully that's not deliberate, but we don't question people's motives. The law doesn't in terms of freedom of speech. And so the accuracy of the expression is not at stake in the United States. Now, during the 1790s, right after the formation of the new government, of course, the question came into play with the Sedition Act, right? And so the Federalists passed the Sedition Acts. Adams very reluctantly went along with this. But Jefferson and Madison immediately wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, calling for the repeal of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and claiming that those were not legitimate grounds at all to restrict freedom of speech. And in fact, that kind of restriction on speech would end up undermining all of our other freedoms in the country. So the restrictions that the founders placed on speech, especially political speech, were very, very, very few and rare if we're talking about Jefferson and Madison. Some of the Federalists were willing to do that in the Sedition Acts, worrying about foreign influence. But of course, the Federalist Party, that was their last hurrah. It was partly because of the Alien and Sedition Acts that they would no longer win national office in the United States.
Our next question. Why aren't our very liberal college professors addressing this anti-conservatism groupthink mentality which currently dominates college campuses? What would our founders suggest?
Well, you know, the academy today, of course, it's professors are almost totally on the left side of the political spectrum. However, there's becoming now a divide that's becoming more apparent between the progressives and the old school, the old school liberals. And some of the old school liberals are very much still respectful of and dedicated to, committed to the idea of free speech, free inquiry, liberal education in its traditional sense. And they disagree with what's called critical theory that is fueling most of the progressive movement, which comes out of not the old American ideas that of freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, those kind of Enlightenment ideas, but instead come from a school of German thought, the Frankfurt School, and particularly from ideas of Marx in terms of critical theory that have to do with a rejection of the idea, in fact, of rights, and a freedom in the sense of the way the American Constitution thinks of these things. So what's going on in the academy? I don't think I said that clearly enough. Let me try that again. The old school liberals are actually, many of them, starting to coalesce with the conservatives. Keith Whittington of Princeton has just started a new organization, AFA, and it is people from both Republicans and Democrats, left and right, calling for academic freedom and with teeth in it. I'm a part of this organization, and we are providing legal help to those professors who are in jeopardy of losing their jobs simply because they've engaged in freedom of inquiry and freedom of speech. So there's a case in which left and right are coming together, just as it should be in the academy. We don't have to agree on anything except for the purpose of the university, to seek the truth and to do that freely. But the folks who are not agreeing with that tend to be what are called progressives, who believe in critical theory and who think that there are really no such things as rights, that everything is situated in a particular time, a false consciousness, and that these things are that we are products of our identities simply, and that we really can't talk to each other or ever understand each other or ever be just to each other. There's almost a permanent marginalized group now that has taken the stand that talk, thought, and education are impossible. What is possible, what is wanted, is very clear, and it's revolution.
Our next question. Our current cancel culture seems to be based on the perception that racism is pervasive in society. Would you agree?
I would agree that that's what cancel culture is based on. It's based on critical theory, and part of critical theory is critical race theory. And that and that is the idea, not only that race is pervasive, but that that there are oppressors and oppressed in society, and that the justice system and the system of rights as we understand it in the United States today is wholly inadequate to that it's a stacked deck. To even talk about the rule of law is a stacked deck. So I would agree that that's part of the argument today. I would not agree that all whites are oppressors and all non-whites are oppressed. I think that's quite a generalization.
Well, that was our last question. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Sheehan for joining us virtually. Hopefully one day you'll be able to join us on campus. I'd like to thank all of our guests, especially those who contributed questions to this evening. And on behalf of Wagner College, thank you and good evening.
Thank you.